Welcome to Part 4, Chapters 7 through 8 of Envirian, a Fable for Conservatives the World Over by Joanna Piccioni Hurley, copyright 2016. This video will be about 30 minutes long. Chapter 7. As divisions grow, the race for president-mayor begins. As the farmers and ranchers worked hard to protect their crops while still following the rules, they became angrier and angrier. During autumn, there was a lot of on-the-front-porch rocking chair talk between neighbors about the upcoming president-mayor race. It was still a long way off, but they were already encouraging 3 men to run for that office. Bump in the south, True in the north, and Rodeo among the ranchers. Bump, True, and Rodeo all had almost the same beliefs. All 3 were conservatives, believed in liberty and free enterprise, and hoped to unshackle their nation from these strange new laws which had never been the way of Envirian Island. Any one of the 3 men would make a good president-mayor and would do the necessary things to make Envirian free and great again. Envirian had been, for over 2 centuries, the happiest, most free nation on earth. Another lovely Christmas was celebrated on the island. Then in January, as the race for president-mayor began, Bump, True, and Rodeo went around the country defending their nation's freedom. They were quite unified in the beginning, and their anger was directed at their true opponents, the Environmentalist Party and their party nominee, Envirian. But they soon had another opponent, because nerdy opposition decided to run for the Environmentalist Party's nomination against Mienton. He was even worse than Mienton, if that is possible, because he truly believed in his liberal policies that would constrain freedom, spit upon liberty, and take away the engine that feeds free enterprise, which is profits, of course. Envirian nation would be lost forever if nerdy opposition won the race for president, nor would it be much better off should Mienton win the race. The race began with conservative speeches from Bump, True, and Rodeo, and liberal speeches from Mienton, and in opposition. But as each tried to win the nomination of the Conservative Party and of the Environmentalist Party, their fights turned inward against one another. In opposition, and Mienton did give a few reasons why they were the better choice for their party's nomination, but they concentrated more heavily on negative campaigning against the conservatives, Bump, True, and Rodeo. The conservatives, on the other hand, argued less and less against their real enemy, the Environmentalist Party, and more against each other. This behavior arose, in part, because each man was desperate to win the nomination as his anger grew and grew against the Liberals. Tommy Bump had the greatest support among the conservatives, who were mostly country folk. The biggest reason was simply name recognition. Bump not only had the largest farm on the southern coast of the island in the Natalian Southlands, but he owned the only company that sold the bug powder. The southern coast had many large, wealthy farms, and these farmers were all backing their neighbor Bump. As well, Bump's father and grandfather had been leaders among their fellow farmers of Envirian, and people had good memories of their leadership. Bump's grandfather had brought the game of golf to Envirian from his native land of Scotland, where golf first began to be played as far back as the mid-14th century. So the people of Envirian loved golf. Bump himself was dynamic, witty, and enterprising. He was a man of ideas, and many believed that he knew how to deal with the Environmentalist Party, who were rule and regulating them right out of their freedom and prosperity. Almost all of the farmers in the North Kirkland farmlands supported Jed True, and his supporters were particularly loyal. He was a leader who never backed down from his principles. He believed in the old ways, the ways of the first fathers of Envirian Island, who had given Envirian its constitution and Bill of Rights. In True's mind and heart, these documents were sacred, inspired by God himself. True loved to read the inscription carved into the stone of Christoran, which so beautifully defended their constitution, and lay on the village green near Nana Bay. Last year, when he had organized the people of the North to dig up and to distribute the orange bug powder, the powder had been free for everyone who had wanted it, the way it should be now, if not for these new regulations. True's supporters resented Bump because he charged people for the yellow bug powder, and now they were forced by the environmentalists and the city council legislature to buy from him, while their free orange bug powder was banned. Some even wondered if Bump's motives for running for president-mayor were strictly profit-motivated. They knew, on the other hand, that True's motives were pure conservatism and devotion to the cause of liberty, their constitution, and the legacy of their first fathers. True's supporters were equally upset with Rodeo, though rather unfairly, because through his leadership the ranchers had begun growing their own alfalfa and barley on communal farms. This had caused a much smaller market for the amount of barley and alfalfa produced by the farmers. Some of the North's smaller farms, which for years had grown mostly alfalfa and barley that they had sold to the ranchers, were forced to sell at considerably lower prices, which left them with almost no profit. Some farmers had given up and moved to the city to look for work. The up and down prices were more than they could handle. All this suffering they unfairly blamed on Rodeo and the ranchers, forgetting that the real cause was their increased cost due to the oppressive regulations of the liberal city council legislature. Rodeo and his fellow ranchers were well aware of all the persuasions and prejudices, divisions and arguments, not only against them, but between the southern farms and the northern farms, or between Bump's supporters and True's supporters. This they very much lamented, because they knew that their real enemies were the liberals in the city council legislature and the Environmentalist Party concentrated mostly in the city. As well, they had not been able to count on the moderates, formerly known as conservatives, in the city council legislature. And, of course, their president-mayor appeared to be, if not corrupt, at least completely in agreement with the entire agenda of the liberal Environmentalist Party. They knew it was Odon Blyton who had brought Mienton over from the continent in order to do his bidding. Furthermore, the ranchers knew that it was the liberal lies about the orange bug powder that had begun the cascade of events that had finally driven a wedge between the farming and ranching hamlets of the North. Rodeo did not want to indulge in the accusations that were now flying back and forth between Bump and True in debates they held on the city square. It had deteriorated to the point that the city's liberals were making jokes about them. But worse, their followers and supporters were digging in their heels, swearing before God and man that if their candidate didn't win the nomination of the Conservative Party, they would never vote for the other candidate in the general election. A Bump supporter stood at the podium in the city square and said before a large crowd, "If Bump doesn't win the nomination, I will stay home rather than vote for True." A week later, a True supporter stood and said, "My vote is reserved only for True. Don't expect me to scratch my X on the line for Bump or Rodeo. It will never happen." Even that raging Cajun Boudreaux almost got in a dust-up over a True supporter's criticism of Bump. He shouted, "Who dat talking bad about Bump? Tell dat couillon to come here so I can put some truth between his eyes. I got him a 4x6 piece of real estate at the bottom of the bayou. If he say one more thing bad about Bump, Like they say, don't mess with a raging Cajun. They've been known to wrestle alligators just for their meat. Anyway, everybody knew that Boudreaux was all talk and no action. And as for being from a refugee family, he could be forgiven for not understanding free speech as found in the Constitution of Envirian. But Envirian natives had no excuse when they attempted to stop anyone's political speech, no matter how offensive they deemed it. Freedom cannot exist for long where free speech is curtailed, even in the smallest measure. But I digress. In the end, Rodeo himself was maligned so badly during debates with Bump and True by an outsider who later backed Bump that Rodeo felt obliged to enter the fray with guns blazing. His supporters, who were mostly ranchers, urged him on. "Don't back down, keep attacking," they insisted. "You are the only one who can beat Mienton in the general election. You must win the nomination." It was not in Rodeo's nature to attack the very men who were on the same side as he. He would have preferred continuing to direct his attacks at Mienton, Blyton, and the policies of the Liberal Environmentalist Party. But the attacks on him had caused him to lose support, and he truly believed in his heart that he was the only one of the three who could beat Mienton and then repeal these harsh and unnecessary regulations and laws that were the foundation of the island's woes. So, in the middle of the nomination process, Rodeo began to attack his fellow conservatives, True and Bump, in speeches and debates to the surprise of everyone. His heart was not in it, for Rodeo had a kind heart that heard the cries of the widows and orphans of Envirian. But he felt he had no choice if he had any chance of gaining the nomination. Truly, his heart felt sickened by the process. After all, there were only minor differences between them really. Like True, Rodeo loved the principles upon which their first fathers had founded the nation of Envirian. He would fain have defended them with his own life. Like True, he believed that the Constitution of Envirian was sacred, inspired by God, that within its words lay the basis of their freedom and individual rights. And he was in perfect agreement with Bump in desiring a strong military defense for their lovely island paradise, and in demanding the removal of these regulations and laws that were literally eating away at the Envirian economy. Bump also was in agreement with the other two on most issues. Like True and Rodeo, Bump was very aware of the profound losses of the small farms in the north, and he believed that the use of the free orange bug powder should never have been banned. It had served a purpose for those small farms that was much needed, and he truly didn't need the extra revenue those farms had brought him when they purchased his yellow bug powder. He was with True and Rodeo on that and many other issues. They all were clearly on the same side, and yet the attacks between them continued. As each conservative nominee increased the volume and content of his attacks against the others, his supporters became more deeply entrenched in their exclusive devotion to their chosen nominee. This strange movement that began with a few conservatives swearing the denial of their vote to any but their chosen nominee started to grow. I say strange because there never was an angrier constituency than the country folk of Envirian Island. It is hard to put into words the depth and breadth of their anger toward the Liberal Environmentalist Party. The laws that party had instituted were threatening their very livelihood, something so basic that they could not ignore it. And yet, somehow, this anger had swelled up and oozed outward, enveloping every idea, policy, or person that was not exactly what each conservative disciple wanted. In so strictly defining their fight against the Liberals, they had unwittingly weakened the solidarity of their cause. Though they spoke to one another in private as if they were united as one against the Liberal Environmentalist Party, in fact, they were not united at all. They divided themselves into sub-parties, each exclusively able to support only Bump, True, or Rodeo. In their hearts, conservatives were divided on every small and picky issue imaginable, including the candidate's personal characteristics. The blustery, bombastic character of Bump offended the humble followers of True, but the strict, uncompromising, and critical nature of True offended Rodeo's ranchers, who loved Rodeo for his warm heart and his great compassion for the outcast, the widow, and the orphan. As the debates continued, political issues were lost to attacks on personality, character, and even physical characteristics. Some even wondered if Rodeo had lost his warm heart after all, because he unrelentingly dove into attacks on Bump that stuck in the memories of everyone like a tick sticks to a dog. And there we have a colorful picture of shearing sheep in the hamlets. Chapter 8. The Nomination, Bill Basic, and the Stay-at-Home Movement. On a warm summer day in June, all the conservatives went to the school buildings in their hamlets or to the county seats of each of the island's 12 counties and cast their votes for the Conservative Party's candidate for president-mayor. Right here, I wish to make honorable mention of a fourth candidate for the Conservative Party. His name was Bill Basic, who I have not mentioned up to this point, because his supporters, though loyal, were few in number. But to his credit, Bill Basic stayed in the fight to win the nomination up to the very end. Therefore, his story merits at least a mention. Bill Basic had criticized the other candidates less and talked more about substance than any of the other three nominees. He had tons of excellent executive and lawmaking experience and a remarkable ability to bluntly explain conservative issues with great ideas on how to solve problems. Also, he knew how to work with people in order to get things done. Finally, he was very compassionate toward people in all walks of life. But Bill Basic, for some odd reason, did not get many votes during the nomination process, except in his own county and the Midwestern hamlet of Silver Lake, where the people truly loved him. More than anything, Bill Basic loved the Envirian Constitution and the inspiring words found on the stone of Christoron. He was an honorable man of great substance, but somehow most of the conservative voters did not see it. Too bad, too, because like Rodeo, he polled very well against Mienton. Was he just too, basic? Not enough pizzazz, sparkle, celebrity? But isn't knowledge, substance, and experience what is needed to be president? Who can understand politics really? Well, back to the race. The 12 counties handed in their vote counts to Conservative Party leaders that warm June day, and it was not surprising when Tommy Bump won the Conservative Party nomination, since he had most of the Southern vote, while the Northern vote was split mostly between Smarto Rodeo and Jed True, with Bill Basic getting only a handful of votes in the Midwest. Bump's win presented a problem for the Conservative Party because he was, of the four, the most controversial character. The party had a real job ahead of them, trying to rally the entire Conservative constituency behind their candidate. This strange movement, that I will call the stay-at-home movement, had taken a strong hold on Conservative voters, unfortunately. Still, one of Bump's qualities as a candidate was his ability to tap into the grievances of the conservative country folk. He clearly stated how the dishonesty of the Liberals and their manipulation of the truth had created the rules and regulations that were threatening the livelihood of the farmers and ranchers of Envirian and the food supply of Envirian Island. On the Liberal side, as their debates continued, it was clear that Miss Opal Imalaya Minton had obtained most of her political ideas from her life on the continent. She believed in a big, bloated government making all the decisions for the common man. She felt that the common man or woman didn't know enough to make decisions for themselves. She was winning the nomination in large part because she had votes from special superdelegates in the Environmentalist Party. Nerdy opposition thought these powerful superdelegates were quite unfair, since the Liberal people, the common man, were voting for him in droves. But this was odd, because Nerdy's political platform was so deeply socialist that, of all people, he ought to have understood how those things worked in Liberal Party politics. Referring to the superdelegates, I mean. As for Minton, her attitude was, "What difference does it make?" It was not a surprise when a little later, Imalaya Minton won the Environmentalist Party nomination in a landslide. But a landslide that had those squirrely superdelegate votes, to be sure. As Bump began his campaign against Minton, he found that he was still fighting the criticism that had been leveled at him by True and Rodeo and their constituencies. The Liberals grabbed onto their critical remarks and ran with them. Liberals had their own criticisms, of course, which were full of lies. They accused Conservatives of wanting dirty air and dirty water, and of greed, prejudice, and even hate. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Conservatives, mostly country folk, just wanted to be allowed to work hard, solve problems as needed without unreasonable impediment, and enjoy the fruits of their labors. Conservatives just wanted their freedom, and as much as possible, to be left alone by government and not to be taxed, ruled, and regulated to death. Since most of the citizens of Envirian City were liberal and were behind Imalaya Minton, Bump's strategy was to dodge as much liberal criticism as possible and espouse his politically conservative agenda in every venue where he could speak to his true constituency, the conservative voter. Statistically, 55% of the nation of Envirian were conservative, while 45% were liberal. Thus, statistically, Bump knew that he should easily win the election, but there was a general unease among the Conservative Party upper echelon because of this strange movement, which started during the nomination process. Would True's supporters and Rodeo's backers be able to put away the dislike of Bump and give him their vote? The future of the nation depended upon it. Should Minton win the election, there was no way she would not attempt to accomplish the full agenda of the Environmentalist Party, which meant that they would completely ban the use of both the yellow and orange bug powder. The mite infestation would take over. Crops would be lost. Farmers and ranchers would go bankrupt. And Envirian City would starve without the importation of food from the continent. And here's a nice picture of feeding the lambs. Bump was a good man. More than anything, he wanted the free enterprise and abundant productivity of Envirian Island to continue and to flourish. He knew the power of the free market system, competition, and reducing regulation on business to produce a healthy, robust economy and plenty of good jobs for everyone. After all, it was within the free market that he had earned his wealth. He knew that a strong military would keep Envirian safe and protected, and he knew that where there is abundant productivity, there is plenty available to provide for the poor, the disabled, the widow, and the orphan. Indeed, Bump was a sensible man and a compassionate man with a lot of heart. And above all, he deeply loved Envirian nation. The Conservative Party leaders thought that surely this strange stay-at-home movement would die as conservatives listened to Bump speak to them in support of all their favorite conservative issues. There were 4 debates between Mienton and Bump, who did his best to win over the votes of his own constituency, which was all he needed to win the election. But it was hard to determine if this stay-at-home movement had been buried at last, or if it would rear its ugly head on Election Day. Everyone knew a conservative or two who was planning to stay home rather than vote for Bump. Some were true devotees. Others loved Rodeo to a fault and considered it downright disloyal to give their votes to Bump. This kind of suicidal loyalty was maddening to most Conservative Party leaders and to the everyday conservative who believed that voting was their sacred duty. What are they thinking, they wondered. Don't our conservative voters realize what is at stake? All will be lost if Mienton wins. Our freedoms, our livelihoods, the very food we put in our mouths. Surely this insane stay-at-home movement won't cost us the election. Surely, they said to one another. The months before the election were busy with the strongest Get the Vote Out campaign the Conservative Party had ever conducted. Many party leaders gave Bump their endorsements at a large ceremony at the village green next door to Bump Golf Course, where thousands gathered to hear Bump speak. Of course, Mienton's environmentalists were just as active in their campaign. And worse, they were registering to vote everyone and their dog. It was said that some people they registered had died last year, and others had odd names like King Bob II, Dr. Dudley Doolittle, or Robin the Hood, and his wife, Little Mrs. Riding Hood. Bump tried not to think much about that, and just continued to shake hands, smile, and sign his autograph for those who asked. He was gracious toward everyone, a decent man who loved his family and his country. If he won this election, he would win it honestly, despite the Liberal Party's dubious activities. And when he won, he would make Envirian Nation great again, as it had always been, as it always should be. In his stump speeches, he said to conservative voters, "We are going to win, win, win. We are not stopping. We're going to have many victories for our country. We're going to make Envirian great again." This concludes Part 4 of Envirian, A Fable for Conservatives the World Over by Joanna Piccioni Hurley. On YouTube, please look for Envirian, A Fable for Conservatives, Part 5, Chapters 9 through 10, which will conclude our story. You may contact Joanna at joannaforfreedom@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.